Hey everyone, how's it going? I thought that I would drop in for another Friday Reads 4 weeks later. It is a cold and windy day here in Ames, Iowa. I can definitely start to feel autumn coming in with a vengeance, I would say. And I really like that. I really like the cold. It facilitates reading, to be sure. It does make the walk to the bus stop a little bit unpleasant, but other than that, I'm a big fan of fall and winter, so I'm happy with it. We actually had a little dusting of snow this morning, which is kind of cool. But anyway, I obviously have some books I want to talk about, and I thought that I would start with the one that I actually have finished. I finished it a couple of weeks ago now, but I thought that I would wrap it up here. And that book is Oscar and Lucinda by Peter Carey. I read this as a part of the read-along that's being hosted by Jason from Old Blues Chapter and Verse. He is posting videos about this book. He's posted a video about each quarter of the book, and he has yet to post the last one, but he will, and they've been great videos. And I read this book, obviously on Jason's recommendation. Obviously Jason loves it, and I absolutely loved this. It is possibly my favorite work of fiction that I've read this year, which is saying something, because I've actually read a lot of really great fiction this year. But I think that this does stand above the other novels that I've read this year. So what the novel is about, it's about a young man named Oscar and a young woman named Lucinda. It takes place in the Victorian era. Oscar is from England, and he is an Anglican minister in training. Well, he's in training for part of the book, and then he becomes an actual minister. And Lucinda is from Australia, and she is an heiress. So she inherits a ton of money from her mother and decides to start a glass business. And Oscar is a very interesting character because he doesn't come from an Anglican background. His father is an evangelical Christian and follows this very, what we would probably now call fire and brimstone version of Christianity. I would say that Oscar's father, and probably Oscar himself, could both be classified as religious fundamentalists in their views, biblical literalism, again, the fire and brimstone, the belief in hell, all of this. But then Oscar kind of decided at one point through this weird process that he was going to become an Anglican, and so he and his father sort of have a difficult relationship because his father obviously thinks he's going to hell for not following his specific brand of Christianity. But the way that Oscar and Lucinda meet is that Lucinda goes to London for business, and while she happens to be in London, not knowing who Oscar is, not having met him, Oscar decides that he's going to go and serve a congregation in Australia. And they both happen to meet while they're on a ship to Australia. And they have this one thing in common, which is that they're both addicted to gambling. And the kind of centerpiece of the story, the kind of climax of the story, is that Lucinda and Oscar make a bet that Oscar can transport this glass church several hundred miles from Sydney, Australia, up the coast to a little town called Ballingen. And that's the main centerpiece. It's about a lot of other things, but that's kind of the main arc of the story. What I love about this novel is just how vital each character is. And by that I mean that each character has so much vitality, with Oscar and Lucinda being the centerpiece, but even side characters who only appear for a few scenes just feel so very alive and real and sympathetic, even if they're not always nice. I loved that. I loved the writing. There were several entire paragraphs that I underlined and thought that this is a paragraph that I could copy into a commonplace book, even though I don't keep a commonplace book. And to have 4 entire paragraphs at the span of one novel that I want to copy down and would love to, read aloud and cherish is something else. It doesn't usually happen. Normally in a novel there's like 1 or 2 at most passages. In most novels there's no passages, right? Most novels are not this well written, but the writing in this book is so fantastic. He has a way of oscillating between these very short declarative sentences and these very long what you could almost call run-on sentences that are so beautiful and elliptical and wavy and go in all sorts of directions. And they are just beautiful. There's some beautiful imagery in the writing. It is just such a well-written novel. Definitely, if it's not the best work of fiction that I've read this year, which it may be, then it is at least the best written piece of fiction that I've read this year, if we talk about writing as just a sentence-by-sentence construction. It's easily the best that I've read this year. What I also, two more things I'm going to talk about with Oscar and Lucinda that I love. One is something that Peter Carey captures so well is misunderstandings between people. The way that two people in a room can be talking, and one can think that they know what the other is doing and thinking, and the other can think that they know what the first one is doing and thinking, but both of them is completely wrong, you know? He captures those misunderstandings that we all experience in our everyday lives, where we think we're trying to figure out what other people are thinking, what other people are doing, or why they're doing what they're doing, and we think we know, but we actually don't. When you look into someone else's head, you realize that you're completely wrong. Peter Carey captures that so well by moving from perspective to perspective. You know, this is a third-person story, and it very much is in the vein of those third-person stories that move between the perspectives of different characters, and it does such a wonderful job. And it does it to heartbreaking effect at certain points. I won't spoil anything, but basically the whole plot of the novel, in a way, is based on one of these misunderstandings. And Peter Carey just pulls them off so well. And the last thing that I really like about the novel, that I think is so interesting, is the role that religion plays in it. I said how Oscar and his father, in my opinion, could qualify as, like, religious fundamentalists, who are people who are easy to sort of demonize, right? With good reason, to be quite frank. But Peter Carey portrays them with so much sympathy, right? He doesn't condescend to them, he doesn't demonize them, he doesn't have contempt for them, even though I suspect that if I spoke with Peter Carey in real life, I would realize that he himself is probably not a religious fundamentalist. I don't know, I doubt he might be religious, but I doubt he's a religious fundamentalist. But he still portrays the way that these people function with a lot of sympathy and compassion, right? He's critical, he's definitely critical, for sure, but he's critical of everyone in the novel, whether they're religious fundamentalists or not. He's critical of Lucinda just as much as Oscar, even as he portrays Lucinda's struggles as, you know, a woman in a sexist society, right? That's another big theme of the novel, is the role of women in this society. And colonialism as well, the way that the society in Australia, especially, is built on the backs of people who have been incarcerated in many cases, but also on the backs, more prominently, of the natives of Australia, right? That especially comes in towards the end of the novel. But anyway, I got off my point a little bit there. But it's just a great novel. I really love it, and I'm so excited to read more by Peter Carey. So I can definitely recommend Oscar and Lucinda to you. And it's just wonderful. I'm so glad I read it. Alright, to move on now to some non-fiction. I do have another piece of fiction I'm going to be bringing up, but before that, I want to talk about some non-fiction. I'm not really participating in non-fiction November per se. I obviously didn't post a TBR or anything, but the thing is, I'm reading non-fiction throughout the year. I love non-fiction. I read more of it probably than fiction on the whole. But anyway, I have some non-fiction I want to talk about. So, I read last weekend, in this book, this is the Collected Essays and Poems of Henry David Thoreau, which I'm doing a kind of ongoing buddy read of with Sharon Goforth, who formerly had a channel, now is, you know, a commenter and on Instagram. We're buddy reading this by reading one essay per week, and that's just fabulous. If you want to buddy read a big collection of essays like this, I highly recommend the one essay a week buddy read. It's just a great experience. We're having so many great conversations from this book. But the essay that we finally read in this volume last weekend is Civil Disobedience, which I'm sure that a lot of you Americans watching my channel will have read. I actually can't remember if I had to read it when I was in school. I know that we talked about it, but if I read it, then I didn't retain it to a degree that my absorption of its contents was particularly meaningful. But the main point of civil disobedience is quite simple, right? You have this idea of nonviolent resistance, this idea that we should resist laws that are not in accordance with our consciences. And at the back of Thoreau's essay is, of course, slavery, right? Among other things. The Mexican War he was very critical of. But slavery, I think, is the primary unjust law that he had in mind. Perhaps he even had in mind the Fugitive Slave Act. I don't know. But he had that primarily in mind. And he makes this really compelling case that that the laws of human beings are different from the laws of, what's actually good and bad. And so if you and your conscience do not agree with the laws that are in place, that were put in place by other human beings, then you should disobey them. And if that means going to prison, then so be it. And it was a really compelling argument. He also makes some other interesting comments about big government, about large government. He opens the essay by saying that the best government is the government that governs least, or governs not at all, right? He was a big fan of small government. And that's very interesting in the context of the 21st century, where we have seen the government in this country become more and more powerful, right? I think that's been emphasized by the events of the past few years, especially with the power of the president, the power of the Supreme Court. It's just become astronomically larger than it was in Thoreau's day, and even back then he was already complaining, so who knows what he would have thought of us today. But it was such a great read. It's not long. It maybe goes on a little bit. He kind of makes his point, then keeps feeling the need to go on and on and on about the same thing a little bit. But it's totally worth a read, because it was so inspirational to Martin Luther King Jr., to Mahatma Gandhi, and others. I think it's totally worth reading if you're interested in kind of in activism, in social change, and social justice, and that sort of thing. So I really loved it. And the next essay that I'm going to be reading this weekend is called Walking. And I suspect that will be one of Thoreau's more nature essay kind of pieces. And he's great at nature writing. He can just write about going for a walk in the winter in New England, and I will totally read it. He just knows how to write about experiencing nature in a way that no one else does. Some of the best essays in this collection are about that. So I'm really excited about reading that essay, especially since I've been feeling like I need a little bit of an escape, and to read about that from Thoreau will feel like an escape, right? Just going and reveling in nature. It'll be a nice respite from a lot of the more political and literary essays that Sharon and I have been reading in this collection, and it'll be kind of a nice escape from just the world. So anyway, I wanted to talk about Thoreau a little bit. Another book that is also a buddy read, actually all the books I'm talking about from now on are buddy reads. So this next one is another piece of nonfiction. This is The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker. And so this was published in 1974, I believe, and Ernest Becker actually won a posthumous Pulitzer Prize for it. Ernest Becker died when he was only, I believe, 49. And he was a psychologist. And so this book deals primarily with psychology. And it's always interesting for me. I never remember who might have been around for me to say this, but I'm getting a PhD in social psychology. So I'm not a clinician. I don't do therapy, but I study social psychology. So I study, obviously the way the mind works. And so but I don't read psychology all that often in my spare time, because I spend all day every day learning about psychology, so I'd like to read about something else, learn about something different in my spare time. But this is a book I've been wanting to read for years, because it is it's quite seminal for a certain specialized area of social psychology. But basically, the argument that Ernest Becker makes in the book is that most of human behavior is driven by the fear of death. And so his basic argument is that we humans have this desire to survive, right? We have this desire to go on living and pass on our genes and so on, just like every other animal does, as we see every day in the natural world. But we have developed cognitively so far that we've become aware of the fact that that struggle to survive and pass on our genes and such will one day end and is ultimately futile, that we will die. Now, that is based on the argument that humans are the only species who are aware of their own death, and I've never actually been convinced that no other animal is aware of its own death, just because I don't really see how you can determine that. You know, like, how do you get inside the mind of another animal and figure out whether it's aware of its death? But undoubtedly, I think humans are preoccupied with their death in a way that most other animals aren't. And so, Ernest Becker argues that our knowledge of our own death, coupled with our desire to survive, causes a lot of anxiety. And so that a lot of our behavior can be explained by the anxiety that causes us. And we tend to respond to the tension by repressing it. And the way that we repress it is we invent what he calls hero systems. Ways in which we can all attain some kind of immortality, right? With an easy example, possibly not the best example, being religion, right? Where you go to heaven and live forever, right? And so he sees that as a hero system, as, you know, if you follow the principles of whichever religion you follow, you'll go to heaven, you'll live forever in heaven. But I think more to the point is the kind of secular versions of that. Even if you're not religious, you are part of a culture, and that culture values certain things, certain endeavors. And so if you engage in culturally valued endeavors and make great achievements, you will live forever. And so he argues that a lot of our behavior is caused by those hero systems, by our desire to follow those hero systems, and thus is caused by the fear of death. And he quite brilliantly reframes a lot of psychoanalytic ideas in light of this idea that humans are driven primarily by the fear of death, rather than, as psychoanalysts would say, by sexuality. And that's all quite fascinating. You know, he takes Freudian psychoanalysis and just reframes it in terms of the fear of death, and shows that it just is a much more elegant explanation for a lot of what Freud said. Now, obviously, Freud is not really taken all that seriously in psychology anymore, with good reason. So I wasn't as interested in those parts, but the fundamental idea, the idea that a lot of human behavior is driven by death, I think is fascinating, and has actually been backed up by experiments that have been done since Becker's time, and I obviously can't go into them here. But he kind of ends with this idea that the way to overcome the sort of cycle that the hero system puts us in, this sort of cycle of repression that we're put into by the hero systems, is to find some kind of way of accepting the fact that we are going to die, and that we're just going to, you know, disappear to dust, and that we're ultimately just animals like anyone else, but to kind of reframe that as a way of being one with the universe in a way. And he reframes that in a very religious way, which is probably my one reservation about the book, that he seems to end this whole discussion by saying that the one way to escape the kind of cycle that this desire for heroism puts us in is to basically become religious, which, I don't know, I don't buy it. But anyway, it's a fascinating book. If you're into psychology, this would be a great read. It's well written, but it's not eloquent by any means, but it is easy to read, I would say. And also notable because it makes an appearance in the Woody Allen film Annie Hall. I believe the main character of that film gives this book as a gift to Annie Hall. So if you're a Woody Allen fan, you might like it. I don't know. But anyway, so that's The Denial of Death. I could make a whole video about The Denial of Death. I haven't done it any sort of justice in this Friday Reads, but it's a really fascinating read. Buddy read, by the way, with Jason Harrigan, who is on Instagram as The Ascetic Aesthetic. Sorry, I didn't mention that first. But I'm buddy reading it with Jason Harrigan, which is very interesting, because of course he's a man of faith, I'm not, and so that's been an interesting conversation for us. So anyway, that's a really interesting book. I have two more books to talk about, both also buddy reads. So the first one is another work of fiction. This is The Cossacks by Leo Tolstoy. This takes place in the 19th century. It's about a young man named Olenin, who is in his early 20s. He's an heir. He's inherited a lot of money. And he seems like kind of a wastrel. He's just kind of not doing anything with his life, just kind of not necessarily partying constantly, but he's not really doing anything. He's just kind of floating through life without accomplishing much, which he can do because he has a lot of money. But at one point he realizes how empty his life in sort of the upper classes in Moscow is, and decides that to liven things up, he's gonna go and fight in the war in the Caucasus, which was going on at that time. And so he joins the Russian army and is sent to live with the Cossacks of the title, who are kind of a branch of the Russian nation who live in the Caucasus and kind of a distinct culture. I believe they follow the same religion, but sort of a different version of Russian Orthodoxy, and are kind of in some ways separate, even though they speak the same language. But Olenin is an interesting character. You know, he seems to be kind of that young person who is constantly having epiphanies and constantly thinking that he's finally figured out the meaning of life. And you can kind of see that his epiphanies are all pretty surface level, superficial, that they don't really get him anywhere. And that's very, very interesting to see him just vacillate between all these different ideas. And then he is kind of put beside this other character named Luka, who is a Cossack, and he seems to pretty much know what he's doing. He seems to pretty much know what he wants from life. But what's interesting, I think, about the novel is that we haven't seen yet which one of those two approaches is better, or whether one is better than the other, because obviously Olenin can't seem to figure his life out, and Luka does have his life figured out, but his primary aim in life is to hunt, fight, get married, and so on. And, you know, you can see that as maybe kind of an empty way to live a life, right? Almost as empty as the life Olenin lived in Moscow. And so I think it's interesting to put these two young men as comparison points to each other. You know, one seems to have everything figured out, but is he going anywhere? And the other one seems to have nothing figured out, but also is not going anywhere. So I find that to be extremely interesting. And it's a great novel. Great, you know, Tolstoy is, like Peter Carey, just great at character. All the characters are vital, you know, have a lot of vitality. And I'm just curious to see where the story goes, because it feels like not much has happened. It really is just primarily a character study, primarily of Olenin, but also of Luka. And there's also a lot about this guy named Yeroshka, this kind of old Cossack who imparts a lot of old stories to Luka. And anyway, it's great. I forgot to mention the buddy read again. I'm buddy reading it with Elena Makridina. She and I are, I believe, going to make videos, each of us, devoted to the Cossacks, so keep an eye out for that. But anyway, it's a great, great read. I love Tolstoy, and I hope that next year I will read War and Peace. But anyway, and then the last book is one more buddy read, and I'll mention my buddy readers off the bat this time. I'm buddy reading Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom by David Blight, with Bill Rutenberg from the Rutenberg Library, Patrice Jones, who's a commenter who many of you will know, and Peg from the History Shelf. And we're verging on a quarter of the way through the book, maybe even a third, and it's just wonderful. It's just wonderful. You know, I always hear about great biographies that they're always simultaneously a life of the person, but also a history of the times. And this very much feels that way. This very much feels like a portrait of America at the time. And specifically, there are so many, I think, insights into the way racism worked at the time. And what's interesting is seeing how the racism in that time wasn't exactly the same as the way it manifests in our current time, but it is kind of a ancestor of the racism that we see in our own time, which I think is quite interesting. Another aspect of the book that is extremely interesting is the tension between violent versus non-violent resistance, which kind of goes back to civil disobedience in Thoreau, right? Because Frederick Douglass started out primarily as a proponent of non-violent resistance to slavery. But now, where we are in the book, he is starting to become much more intense in the violent resistance, to a point where even I sort of was a little bit surprised by some of the vehemence of it. But he's becoming much more of the line that, slave catchers, this is the era of the Fugitive Slave Act, that slave catchers deserve to die, basically. And it sounds like that's going to be kind of where he goes for the rest of his life, in this, if they're going to treat us like property, then why should we respect their right to live if they're going to do this, right? And that is very interesting, and that's a dichotomy that has continued to be important, again, in civil rights movements in the black community, I think, through the sort of pairing of Malcolm X with Martin Luther King Jr. and into today. I think it's something that comes up. So anyway, the last thing that I'm reading, I wasn't going to mention it before, but I think I will now. The last thing I'm reading is When the Light of the World Was Subdued, Our Songs Came Through, a Norton anthology of Native Nations poetry, edited by Joy Harjo. And it's great. I'm getting to the end of the Plains Native American section, and pretty soon I think I will be in the northwest part of the book, the Pacific Northwest, Alaska, and Pacific Islands part. And so I'm really liking it, as I kind of expected. But anyway, yeah, I think it's pretty important reading. So that's that. So anyway, I'll leave it at that. Hopefully you all enjoyed. I don't know when I'll be back next. My motivation for BookTube has, as you can probably tell, been spotty. But I thought that I would make a video this Friday. So hopefully you enjoyed, and I will let you all go. Bye.